What is going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 68th ranked Marvel snapper, the worst number possible, here to talk about the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. There are really only a couple places to start here, and pretty much all of them involve Shou-Lao. The nerf to Star-Lord, Shou-Lao's not only biggest competition, but potentially biggest threat in the metagame, has left Shou-Lao as largely the mid-range package of choice. The real question you're going to be asking yourself is, what else am I doing with my Shou-Lao? And the base answer most people have gotten to is, of course, the move list. This is the list that Iris has been playing to maintain rank 1 basically all season. The only notable change is an inclusion of Red Guardian instead of the very hard-targeted Mercury. This is in deference to a relatively more open metagame, as is typical of the moments after an OTA changes significantly what is at the top of the metagame. Now, we'll talk about Star-Lord a little bit later, but in terms of what he's done to the metagame, or the less amount of him has done to the metagame, it is notable. We are very mid-rangey right now at the top of the ladder, and there are a lot of things that are happening that probably wouldn't have happened if he was still sitting on top of everything. The deck that he goes in still works, but it does feel meaningfully worse, and at the top of ladder, I think a lot of players were already sort of prepared to deal with it anyway, which any amount of power loss in a situation like that is going to have an outsized effect. That said, I still think it's pretty clear that Shou-Lao decks are where the metagame is at right now, and figuring out what the best Shou-Lao deck to play into a world of other people playing Shou-Lao decks is a very, very important question. This is what Honifer's build of the Shou-Lao list, which is fused a little bit with the ongoing package, is attempting to do. There are two real ways to get a very big Maverick out of this list, and that is largely what this deck is pushing for. You can either be doing some combination of Captain Carter and Moonstone to make your Maverick like 14 power, or you can be doing some combination of the normal Shou-Lao Maverick stuff, or mix them together. Either way, what this deck is doing is taking the Shou-Lao list and saying, I'm going to have more points than the other Shou-Lao lists if my combo comes together. This means that in matchups against other Shou-Lao decks, snapping is actually much more on the table, where typically in a Shou-Lao matchup, unless you have a very extremely powerful draw, what you do can get invalidated by the Shou-Lao. This list has taken High Infinite by storm. I've been playing it myself. I've quite enjoyed my time with it. It's been a very solid list for me that has done a very good amount to push the archetype forward. And I think more than anything else, it is representative of just how much unexplored space there is when it comes to figuring out what decks can afford to be Shou-Lao decks and what packages can afford to be fused into Shou-Lao decks. You don't have to just take the best mid-range deck, Batroc, and then Shou-Lao and shove them together. Sometimes doing something a little bit off the beaten path, like the ongoing list here, will allow you to access a ton of power that the Shou-Lao list is otherwise unable to do. Captain Carter Moonstone means that your Mavericks have multiple ways to get paid off and also to pay off. For example, a big Maverick is just like the kind of thing you can use to target a Captain Carter. You don't have to be all in. It's just a little bit good at being all in. This is a powerful list that could herald what the future of this metagame looks like, figuring out which of these fusions of Shou-Lao lists is better into the other fusions of Shou-Lao lists. In terms of game volume, my experience has been that there is plenty of Star-Lord still running around. It's just also hybridizing a little bit. Star-Lord Mr. Negative is probably the best version of Mr. Negative, and it can always be helpful in an early and open metagame to just play something that is pretty off the wall and a little bit ridiculous. That's what Mr. Negative is doing right now. This list of Star-Lord Mr. Negative has been crawling around for a little bit right now, but since all-in Star-Lord, at least at High Infinite, is suffering a little bit, there needs to be some other angle that the deck is taking. I'm not saying you can't play all-in Star-Lord, but it's definitely worse against, for example, the ongoing version of the Shou-Lao list than it is against the other versions of the Shou-Lao list, because that deck is so able to deal with a Fin Fang Foom, and your power spikes are so telegraphed that people are gonna stay into you when they beat you, but you're never getting the full value out of it. Largely, I think Star-Lord is suffering from a general sort of overexposure here. Everyone is so used to Star-Lord that they kind of know what to do in the matchup, and so your cube gain ratios have become a little bit inverted. The first week the card came out, no one was really sure what to do. You got a lot of cubes from being a combo deck. Now, I think you're probably on the Galactus edge where people are so used to what you're doing that they're just leaving and you aren't getting any cubes for being a combo deck. And that's a pretty awkward situation for a deck to overcome, which is why you see the fusion with Mr. Negative being so popular right now. Just something that gives you more things that force your opponents out of games, more consistency in getting to that 1 or 2 cube victory as guaranteed as you possibly can get it. That seems to be what Star-Lord is doing right now. There are a couple other Star-Lord builds, but I'm not necessarily confident enough in them to put them as high up on the tier list as you might expect. I have been a big advocate for people playing more Doom 2099 this season, and I think this is a pretty good spot in which to do it. Doom 2099 is potentially the easiest deck in Marvel Snap and really has very little that you can honestly mess up. In terms of play tips, there are really only a couple. If you think that it's possible you're going to play a 5 into a 5 and you have a Moondragon on the board and a Doom 2099, sometimes it can be worth using your Invisible Woman first steps a little bit early. The other play tip I have is you can't be overly confident in your play lines into a Star-Lord deck, but generally speaking, if they're going to be flowcharting the deck, what they're going to be doing is playing the Star-Lord out on turn 4. When they play the Star-Lord out on turn 4, you have Mercury Cannonball and Cosmic Ghost Rider as meaningful answers to what they are going to try to do with the deck. You will beat them if you do those things. That turns off all of their copying, and their deck simply does not beat yours if they are not copying things. So it has that sort of inbuilt balance into what the people are kind of scared of going over the top of it. And this is also a deck that is able to play Cosmic Ghost Rider, which just gives it a lot of natural BS countering. One of the things that happens in early metagames is things are a lot more open, and it's just nice to have something that's like, I don't know if this is the best card in any specific matchup, but it's just good enough in a lot of different matchups to allow the innate power of what your deck is already doing to carry you. Oh, my opponent's doing Moonstone stuff. I'm Cosmic Ghost Ridering it. Oh, my opponent's doing there's like a Maverick I can get rid of. I'm gonna get rid of that Maverick. Oh, there's a Fantomex I can get rid of. I'm gonna get rid of that Fantomex. Oh, there's a Star-Lord that someone just played on turn 4. I'm gonna get rid of the Star-Lord. Like, that's just good. It's just good to have access to stuff like that. And I think as one of the few sort of like curve out decks that is a legit Cosmic Ghost Rider deck, this deck actually does some pretty reasonable work. I think it's just a legitimately underrated, very solid play for most people to pick up. Cerebro 3 is another deck I consider underrated, but as always, you definitely have to have the stomach for playing a deck like this. This is a deck that will lose to itself. There is no real way around it. Now, you might be confused by the Jack Flag in here. Now, this is a bit of an interesting deal. So, the way this works is Jack Flag is an ongoing and Cerebro is also an ongoing. Ongoing layers do not sort of go back and check with each other to prevent things from getting confusing and going infinite. So the way you play Jack Flag in this deck is you just put it to the right of Cerebro, and it will work. Because Cerebro will apply, then Jack Flag will apply, but Cerebro won't go and recheck. It's a little more complex than just being the right of Cerebro. If you imagine the first lane as 1, 2, 3, 4, where 1 and 2 are the front and 3 and 4 are the back, and then the second lane as 5, 6, 7, 8, where 5 and 6 are the front and 7 and 8 are the back. It just has to be after the Cerebro in that numeric order, but putting it on the right is a good shorthand. It will work. You are able to do stuff with this. And that is a really notable thing. But one thing you're going to want to avoid is you want to avoid putting it in a lane with anything that got basted. That's a whole different layering thing. If you put it in a lane with something that got basted, then Jack Flag will see the buff there. What you're counting on with Jack Flag is that he doesn't see the Cerebro buff or the Cerebro buff doesn't see him. But if there's another buff at play, he will see that and it will mess up your Cerebro. complex, but it is functional. That said, Cerebro 3 is in much the same position as it already was. This is a deck that is very good at doing strong things. This is a deck that has a lot of power built into it, and frankly, as long as it does what it's trying to do, it will win games. The power output is massive. There are very few other decks that can have this much power while also having things like Daredevil Cosmo and really meaningful counterplay to a lot of other things. The obvious and constant downside with Cerebro, it's Cerebro. Sometimes you just lose to the locations and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's always going to hold this deck back, especially on ladder. I'm a big believer in Aurora mid-range lists, not necessarily as like incredibly powerful, but as basically consistently playable. I think you're going to see a lot of very solid Aurora decks floating around here. None of them are going to be able to be called realistically the best deck in the game, but I just genuinely think that Aurora is a card that brings an archetype of disparate BS together. This is an archetype. It is the kind of thing that will go into the history books a year from now as, oh yeah, the Aurora archetype. And we aren't used to talking about it like that yet, but I do think that it is very much going to be in that conversation. In much the same way as Destroy often sneaks onto these lists and Discard often sneaks onto these lists, I just think that people need to start referring to Aurora as an archetype. And I think this is a good archetype. It balances disruption and power very efficiently. If you want to go even harder with it, you can go into the Jean Grey Cosmo stuff that's not entirely necessary in a world where there's less Star-Lord, but in a world where you are still afraid of that guy, you absolutely can do that. There is just a lot of disruption and power built into what this deck is doing. A lot of counter cards that are able to be used in a deck like this because Aurora is buffing them. If anything, I think that this deck reminds me the most, actually, of like the old tech Thanos lists. That's what this deck actually plays like. And that's what you should keep in mind when you're playing a list like this. Let's talk a little bit about stock Star-Lord. I think stock Star-Lord is a lot more of a deck where you have to set up checkmates than a deck that gets them for free now. Like, you lost a lot out of the power of this deck. There is some meaningful downgrades that you're having to deal with here, which is why I have the Daredevil back in, because I kind of just think I have to be a checkmate deck. Another card that you could play instead of the Daredevil, perhaps, is a Bruce Banner, because you kind of just need the power at this point. But generally speaking, I think that what happened in the nerf was that you lost a free win. A lot of the time, you'd be able to do some kind of free win with just playing a Star-Lord, doing the Star-Lord combo, Eliathing something, playing a big guy somewhere else. That's a lot less free. Like, when you do Star-Lord into Arnim Zola, you have, like, 4 less points on the board. You play Eliath, you have 5 less points on the board. You might think that doesn't matter, but it does. It actually just kind of does. And so, when you have a deck like this that is still powerful, I think, but so the exact same as what you've already been doing, and worse at doing that thing, I just sort of am not sure exactly where to go with the archetype from here that doesn't involve a very inefficient cube gain ratio. This is a deck that I think maybe has maxed out its potential, where it's still going to be not particularly fun to play against. You're still not going to feel very good about it, right? Because they're cheating a bunch of energy into cards that either invalidate the numbers on the cards you played or the text on the cards you played. It doesn't feel good, but this is a deck that has a very, very clear and obvious pattern. You can absolutely just handle it as a meaningful part of the metagame. And I think a lot of the time, you'll just sit there and you look at them and you're like, can I beat Juggernaut Fin Fang Foom? And if you can, you do it. And if you don't, you leave. And that's just kind of a lot of what this deck is. Like, it's not special. It is a very real and beatable deck, and I think that it lost a notable amount of its power with the Star-Lord changes. Like, a lot of people were thinking that it would do nothing, and sort of, right? Like, you can still do the combo and get a bunch of guys, but it turns out that, like, points win games, and you kind of were getting a lot of them for free. And now you're getting a lot less of them for free. And it does actually matter. Like, when you're doubling a Fin Fang Foom, yeah, you're probably winning the Fin Fang Foom lane. But what about the lane where you're playing the Fin Fang Foom on their front line of like a Captain Carter? Are you getting a lot out of that lane? That's the other thing that's happened, is the rise of the ongoing version of the Shou-Lao deck is really, really good into like just Fin Fang Foom shenanigans. That's definitely a thing to keep an eye out for if you are playing the stock Star-Lord list. If you wanted something a little bit more off the wall, you can try Derek's build of Dracula Dump with Star-Lord. This is a pretty straightforward list. The idea here is basically skip, Star-Lord 5, 11 energy, Fin Fang Foom Dracula, using a Black Swan to play all of your ones, so your Dracula is like 18 power, all your ones leave your hand, and then you also, of course, play Fin Fang Foom. That's the entire deck. It's very much a flowchart, aggressive strategy where you have no real control over how the game is going to play out beyond where your points are going to be. It plays a lot like a Moon Girl deck, but it can be quite good at dealing with various mid-range piles. If you enjoy easy decks that really just stress a lot of point output on the final few turns of the game, this is a deck that I think could be particularly enjoyable for you. Really straightforward, really easy, almost like an old school Sarah Hitmonkey deck. Just a relatively powerful, straightforward, and more interesting use of Star-Lord than a lot of other stuff I've seen. In terms of decks that are skipping till Star-Lord on 5, I mean, you could also just be playing Star-Lord Hela. I don't think that's a bad choice right now either. Any of these decks that are just doing not the Star-Lord combo, I think are probably going to be at least a little bit beneficial, because people are so used to the Star-Lord combo at this point, there's very little cube equity in it. Anything that's doing even something slightly different, people are going to be a little more like, okay, I don't know what's going on, maybe I can beat it kind of thing. That is valuable right now. I only really had room for one ramp deck, but consider this just an entry for both ramp decks. You can play the normal version of ramp here too as well. I'm showing the Ramplactus one here because I think it's just a little bit more interesting and attacks the Shou-Lao decks on a little bit more of a compelling basis for me, where I think the normal ramp decks are unfavored notably in the Shou-Lao matchup without really a lot of ways to change that. The Ramplactus decks inject an element of variance into the game that I think they need in order to go over the top of what seems to be a fairly consistent consensus that Shou-Lao is a dangerous and powerful mid-range deck that you really have to respect. And that is what this list is trying to do. I don't think it's necessarily better in a flat sense than the other ramp list, which you probably are already aware of. It's been a part of the metagame for like 3 months now. That deck is still good. There is nothing wrong with that deck. I just think that specifically in a world that we're heading into with Shou-Lao and things of that nature, I'm going to want to be prepared for that matchup, and I just am not confident in playing one card a turn against the Shou-Lao list. It just is not a realistic thing for me. Another thing that has helped a little bit is the ability to have Alioth in this deck. Even just that is enough to give you a little bit more into the Shou-Lao list, but largely what Ramp is doing here is saying, I'm probably losing to Star-Lord, I'm probably losing to Shou-Lao, so in order to prevent that from happening, I've got this YOLO Galactus thing, and hopefully that is able to take me over the top of these absolute shenanigan gamers. Supergiant's in a bit of a weird spot where I think that this is still a deck that is probably the easiest and most straightforward deck if you want to be countering Star-Lord. You're going to be able to do that, but Supergiant is typically best wheeled out in relatively solved metagames where a lot of what it's doing is built into what Supergiant is. So a lot of people are playing Star-Lord, whip out the Supergiant. A lot of people are playing Invisible Woman First Steps, whip out the Supergiant, right? Like, it's a sort of specific answer. And we're in a metagame that is still new enough and experimental enough that you don't feel great about it. And it's like, okay, yeah, I can disrupt my opponent's Shou-Lao. And you can, but I don't think that that's like a winning strategy against what those decks are doing, because that's still a bigger guy than your Ronin. And you're both mid-ranging it up, and they're very able to have more power than you. It's an interesting dynamic. Supergiant feels like a deck that's in basically every game, and you'll always have outs in basically every game. But on the downside, it's a little bit boring. It's a little bit straightforward. It's a little bit drag your opponent down to my level and try to beat them with experience. It's kind of an iffier choice right now that it's not hard targeting one of the best decks in the game. It's instead hard targeting like the 5th best deck in the game, or whatever you think Star-Lord is. It's hard targeting that, and it's like, okay, that obviously drops this deck standing a bit. Couple alternative supergiant builds. This is, of course, Mover Giant. The base bet being made here is that it's just better to be Mercury Cannonball than it is to be a Ronin deck, and it's just better to be Sam Batroc than it is to be everything else normal supergiant plays. That strikes me as a very reasonable bet to make. I have no objections to this theory. I think it makes a lot of sense. The same bet is being made here with Zenaid's Sauron Supergiant deck. It's the exact same premise. It is better to be this points package than the base Supergiant points package, and instead of actually seriously trying to interact beyond what a normal Supergiant deck does, what we're just going to do is use cards that have points and play the game that way. The loss here is Cosmo, which previous to the Star-Lord nerf would not have been an acceptable loss, but it is more acceptable in this world. And that means that this is a deck that is able to use Negasonic to threaten Shou-Laos. That's a very reasonable thing to do, because a lot of the time, Shou-Lao's going to have one really big guy coming down on the final turn, so Negasonic can be a really threatening card. That combination, Supergiant Negasonic, is largely the best thing you're doing against those Shou-Lao lists when you're able to make it happen. But this deck also just has a lot of points, and that can just be an important thing to have. Big Babies v Fantomex is running around. I think that I'm putting this on here because I really need to represent Fantomex in some way, but I'm not really sure exactly which of the multiple Fantomex lists is the best, but this is the one that most people are playing because Dexter did a video on it. So we're going to talk about this. This is the Fantomex list that fuses itself with Victoria Hand. Not all of them are doing this. What this deck gains by doing that over the other Fantomex lists is it has way less turn 5s and turn 6s that are just absolutely unplayable dog. Anyway, this is a very reasonable list that does some pretty powerful stuff. There's legitimate power in a Fantomex list, especially if you're able to fuse it with other directions. Other things Big Baby has been doing include Prodigy fusions with it to make sure you get multiple Fantomex procs, but largely what this deck does is just put strong amounts of power on the board and use Fantomex as a sort of additional piece of that strong amount of power gameplay. What you can get a lot out of with this list is dealing with the sort of Captain Cartery builds of the Maverick Shou-Lao decks. It is a deck that has reasonable game into those lists, I think. It can lose to the nut draws, but a lot of the mid draws tend to favor you. Gambit, of course, a very powerful card. And also, it only really has a couple of outs to an opposing Star-Lord, so it got better now that people are playing a little bit less of that deck. Those outs, of course, are gambiting the Star-Lord on 4 with priority, and, of course, using your turn 5 to make the Star-Lord have no text, similarly to every other deck playing Cosmic Ghost Rider. As a Cosmic Ghost Rider deck, this deck does have some notable day one of the metagame kind of upside here. You just have a lot of outs to stuff, but really what you're worried about are things that go way over the top. Like Smiz's version of the Arms deck, definitely going way over the top. This is a deck that is doing stuff that is fundamentally ridiculous, and the basic premise is I'm going to copy Mr. Fantastic about 10 billion times. You can do this, you can do Tribunal, either direction you want to take the list, you will be able to do something that is honestly quite powerful. There's a lot to be said for ongoing builds right now because people just aren't really building for them. At the top of ladder, you're starting to see a lot more Red Guardians and Cosmic Ghost Riders in deference to the fact that we are no longer in like functionally a 2 or 3 deck metagame. A lot of decks were built specifically for Star-Lord and Shou-Lao and now have to respect other things. Iris with the Red Guardian, and of course the multiple decks we've talked about already running Cosmic Ghost Rider make this deck a bit of a harder decision. But that's because this deck and decks like it have forced them to make those decisions. If people were still playing the decks from last week, decks like this would have absolutely no counters to them at all. That's how good they are when they do what they want to be doing. Sometimes just picking a combo deck that people aren't teching for is the best thing you can be doing. Similarly, you could just be playing the smaller version of On-Going. This is another deck that is just consistently underrated. It's just never been anything but tier 2. It's just so incredibly solid across metagames. For some reason, every so often, people forget that this deck exists, but I can't think of a metagame where it's not like at least kind of functional. Some version of this has basically always been very solid. And even though I think it's probably better to be fusing it with Shou-Lao right now, that doesn't mean that the normal version of this deck is anything in the realm of unplayable. I'm being disrespectful by putting this at the end of the tier list. This is a better deck than many, and you know how I can tell it's a better deck than many is because it has Shou-Lao and Maverick in it. Yeah, if you watched my video yesterday, you know how I feel about this package of cards. Pretty much every deck that is a sort of time-honored archetype in Marvel Snap that can afford to be doing this should be doing this. And I do want to say, as much as I was talking about Shou-Lao specifically yesterday, I think it's important to clarify that a lot of the blame for this goes on Maverick. Like, a lot of the blame for this goes on Maverick. A lot of the blame for this goes on Maverick. I really can't stress that enough. Like, as much as I say, oh, Shou-Lao is the problem, it's like 55-45 Shou-Lao Maverick. Like, that's realistically what we're talking about here. I don't want people to come away from that video that I did yesterday thinking it's all Shou-Lao, and I realized that that's my framing. It was the fault of my framing and how I talked about it. I want to be super clear. Maverick is also extremely culpable in what is going on here. Immensely, extremely culpable. This is a deck that shouldn't have to be doing this, but because it is such a powerful thing to do, because this deck is already able to do what it wants to be doing just by the virtue of playing the normal game plan it normally wants to play, this is just a better destroy deck than any other destroy deck is going to be. And I don't know how people are supposed to feel about that, but this is definitely the best destroy deck in the game. I think it's just an actively good deck, and that's why it's disrespectful to put this so far down, because there's just no way that the last deck on the tier list should be a Shou-Lao deck. We can't be serious about that. It just definitely is better just because it is a Shou-Lao deck. Destroy is a deck that has a very powerful plan A in the form of the Deadpool stuff, and now it has a very powerful plan B in the form of the Shou-Lao stuff. It does work. When you pop off with this deck, you are doing more points than so many other Shou-Lao decks are even close to being capable of. Have you ever played a Shou-Lao, a giant Deadpool, and also like a Shou-Lao on a Maverick, a giant Deadpool, and then Maverick to free death? It's ridiculous. The power level here is monstrous. It's gated by it doesn't happen a lot, but your downside being like, I'm probably Shou-Laoing with a death maybe, you're chill. That's fine with you. That's just a really good floor racer. And that's what Shou-Lao and Maverick are doing in this deck. They're raising the floor. This deck has always had a super high ceiling and a relatively low floor compared to other combo decks because of how draw dependent its actual combo output is. Now it has a super high ceiling and a much higher floor thanks to Shou-Lao and Maverick. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And I will see you in the next one.